What makes something epic? Because that's a very intentional word to use. Epic fantasy doesn't come to exist because of subtle decisions. It's a genre full of grand scale, high stakes, and decisions defined by life or death. From Tolkien to Sanderson and every stop in between, epic fantasy has established a kind of story that is wholly unique and impressive. It's shaped generations of readers. And today, we break down the key elements of the genre, including necessary reading and recommendations, character archetypes, and tropes required by the form. Welcome to the Writing Theory Podcast, a podcast for every level of writer. Everything that we discuss here on this podcast is about pushing you to the next level of storytelling, from prose to structure to the business of writing. You can join me every Wednesday for a new episode, a new topic, and a new takeaway that you can apply to your own writing right away. I'm Carson Long. Let's get started. So this type of podcast episode has been something I've wanted to do since the very beginning, a genre breakdown. I mean, even before the Writing Theory podcast was specifically a thing, I was like, I need to do videos about the genre expectations of different kinds of stories. And maybe one day this will make it into a video series, but for now, let's see if I can just nail down the info in an interesting way. And the only way to really get this kind of information, these genre expectations, is to read books widely across that genre. It's not really something you can parse out just by looking from the outside in. So there are certain genres I feel pretty confident to tackle myself, but there are so many other genres that I don't have the necessary exposure to, and I'm looking for authors and content creators who are experts in those genres. So if you know someone, an author, either self-published or traditionally published, who is an expert at a certain genre, share them in the comments below or come to the Discord and let me know. I'd love to have someone on the podcast who is an expert in mystery or romance or romantasy or any other genres that we need to break down. And that being said, let's tackle epic fantasy, which is one genre I feel extremely capable in talking about. Epic fantasy is probably the genre I've read most in my life. And fantasy as an umbrella term is where I spend most of my time, but I've always had a special place in my heart for the epic fantasy. So I guess the first question is, what defines epic fantasy? Because that's kind of an important thing to know, especially because we're under an extremely large umbrella term of fantasy. Epic fantasy is more than just a big fantasy story. Even though you do see most epic fantasy books as giant tomes, epic fantasy is about scope, it's about stakes, and it's about the sense of an expansive, fully realized, evolving, and involved world. Whew, it's a mouthful. How does epic fantasy differ from other fantasy subgenres that you might have heard about, like high fantasy or sword and sorcery, or the ever-present grimdark? Well, the first thing to note is that stories are usually a blend of different subgenres, right? A grimdark epic fantasy is totally a thing. So maybe right off the bat, you might wonder why even have subgenres, terms like these, because aren't all of these stories fantasy? Of course they are. They are. Fantasy is our umbrella term. And if you really wanted to, you could choose to just ignore all of the different subgenres. But each specific term helps you understand the story. And this is great for an author who's selling a novel, but it's also important for a reader because these sort of subgenres just tell you so much about the book. You can use this in so many different ways. But there's also a danger. There's a danger in miscommunication about these subgenres. If your book is advertised to a reader as an epic fantasy, but it doesn't have those necessary parts of an epic fantasy, then that reader is going to be left disappointed. Maybe they don't like the story, and that's why we have to be aware of genre expectations. So with the understanding of the importance of this, let's talk about what makes epic fantasy epic fantasy. And the very first thing to point out is world building. Maybe the heart of all fantasy. The world of an epic fantasy story feels alive. It has typically rich histories, cultures of people that are vastly different, and conflicts that may span over tens, dozens, hundreds, thousands of years. I mean, for example, Middle-earth, of course, in The Lord of the Rings, isn't just a setting behind the story. It's a living, breathing world, and every detail about Middle-earth helps shape the story that's told. Of all the staples of epic fantasy that we're going to go over, this might be the most important. Do not underestimate the importance of the setting of these stories, because without a fantastical setting, fantasy isn't fantasy. It's maybe the core defining feature of everything here. Just like how you can't have a science fiction story without there being some sort of technological shift in our world. iRobot exists because what if we had robots that followed these 3 laws and they were, sold all over the place and then they went bad, right? That's the science fiction part of a science fiction story. When it comes to fantasy, the world is what makes a fantasy story fantasy. This is a requirement. If you don't do this element of the story, if you don't put time into the setting and the world building and creating something that a reader can get immersed in, you are going to fail in writing an epic fantasy, 100%. Now, when I'm describing the setting, I'm not just talking about things like the land or the fantasy map at the front of the book and the little words scrawled on the map to say, here's the spine of the world and here is this town where the elves live. It goes beyond geography. It goes beyond land. It's people and possibly religions, possibly gods or higher beings. It means your world might have new races and creatures and entirely unheard of political systems. Epic fantasy typically requires that kind of focus on the setting. And of course, most of the time, this tends to extend out to magic systems, another staple of the genre. And while I don't think epic fantasy requires there to be wizards and witches and slinging fireballs or whatever the case may be, a lot of times it does. And so it's a very welcome addition to an epic fantasy story. Now, that could be hard magic systems, a la Brandon Sanderson, or soft magic systems where things aren't ever really described, but you know that they are there. A very common addition. Now, world building, very important. But another key component of the epic fantasy is simply the scale of the story. And while the world may be huge, typically, we're also talking a large amount of other things. I know that sounds weird. I'm trying. Hold on. Let them cook. In addition to this crazy world, epic stories also tend to center around stakes that could change that world. A lot of times, I'll tell you right now, it's a battle of good versus evil. And usually it's a pretty on-the-nose battle of good versus evil. And talking about scale, most of the time, while epic fantasy can be a standalone novel, it's often broken into multiple parts in order to create this large scale. But even in those standalone books, you typically might get even more novellas or disconnected books in the same world, kind of taking advantage of all the work that's been done. You see it all the time. And A Song of Ice and Fire, this is a very easy thing to nail down, right? A Song of Ice and Fire involves multiple kingdoms spanning across multiple conflicts, large-scale wars, dragons, cities burning down, hundreds and thousands of people being killed by the ramifications of the characters. That's large scale. But it gets even bigger. Malazan Book of the Fallen, one of my favorite epic fantasy series, takes place over hundreds of thousands of years and across multiple continents, and even, for lack of a better word, multiple dimensions. I know, it's insane. The scale of these kinds of stories typically is one of the major draws of an epic fantasy reader. I know so many people that have gone out of their way, even if they don't have a lot of experience in the genre, looking for a story specifically to get lost in. And what they're talking about is a place where a world where they can spend a lot of time, a world that's really developed, a world that is interesting and complex, that rivals our own. And by reading these books, they can escape whatever stresses they're facing in the real world and be in this other location. That is epic fantasy. Let's talk a little bit more about the stakes of an epic fantasy story, because a lot of times it can be boiled down to the idea of good versus evil, empire versus rebels, dark versus light. And while sometimes it is really on the nose, here we have our character who is clearly the embodiment of good things, who's going up against the Dark Lord or something like that. It can also be a little more subtle. It tends to not be, but it can. It can. And a great example of our epic kind of fantasy stories that don't fall into these very on-the-nose tropes, A Song of Ice and Fire. You're going to hear me quote this a lot because it is one of the all-time greats of epic fantasy. In A Song of Ice and Fire, it isn't the end of the world, but it's still a world-changing series of events with kingdoms falling and people dying. But it's also not just good versus evil. One of the great things that George R.R. Martin does in his stories is the characters all have motivations, and you may not like it, but pretty much everyone there is acting in self-interest, and you can at least understand it. Now, I will say, George R.R. Martin is an outlier. When we're talking about stories of good versus evil, there's so many options to choose from. To showcase what we're talking about here. And one of my favorites is going to be The Wheel of Time. The Wheel of Time, where every X amount of years, the Dragon Reborn goes up against the Dark One, or the Dark Lord, or whatever he's called in the series. Very on the nose, right? You're supposed to defeat the Dark One. That's epic fantasy. It happens a lot. And while the world is large in these books, the stakes are high, it's good versus evil. Another major draw of epic fantasy is how we experience all this. And usually that's through a couple tropey things. How many epic fantasies have some sort of chosen one trope? One person that can save the world. One person who can defeat the evil one. One unlikely hero going on a quest to save the day. I love it. But more than just having an unlikely hero, a single unlikely hero, most epic fantasies have huge casts of characters. And while there might be a chosen one, there's typically multiple protagonists, different factions, interconnected stories between characters as people are moving all across the land and coming in and out of other people's stories, which is so cool. For example, you're not going to believe this. The Wheel of Time has 2,787 named characters in the series. 2,787 named characters. Of course, they aren't all important. Of course, I just chose this number because it's insane. But of the characters who are important, the Wheel of Time wiki says that there's 147 different POV characters in the series. These are just the characters that are important enough to the story we actually see through their eyes. We get access to their thoughts. We see them change or live or die. 147. It's typical in epic fantasy to see that big cast of characters. And keep in mind, this isn't all exposed in book 1. The Wheel of Time is 14, 15 books that you go through. So, all of that's spread out over the whole series, but multiple POVs, big cast of characters, all very common in the epic fantasy. Sometimes these characters might never even cross paths. They may die before they ever speak to another POV character in the story. But because of them, we got exposed to the world in a specific way that the author wanted us to. Those big cast of characters allow there to be an insane scope to these novels. You could almost say epic fantasy is defined by scale. Whether it's in the world building, in the conflict and the stakes, or the number of characters, just about every single epic fantasy embraces this idea of a sprawling story. If you want to write epic fantasy, you need to think big, of course, right? You need that big scale, but you also need to think deep. It's not just that the world is big, it's that the world has detail and feels alive. Your story needs to be deserving of the world, and the world needs to showcase the story. I thought this was kind of interesting. I was thinking about what are some of my favorite kind of fantasy worlds in the epic fantasy space, and what could I pick as sort of an actionable takeaway from maybe you writing your own epic fantasy. And one thing I thought was interesting is in these 4 epic fantasies I'm about to talk about, every single epic fantasy has some sort of core historical event that kind of kicks everything else into motion. And I think this is really interesting because it's not necessarily your inciting incident for your story, but it's a pivotal, it's a pivotal event that changes everything in your epic fantasy world. In the Wheel of Time, there's this recurring fight between the Dragon Reborn and the Dark One that leads to a split in the world. Okay, that one's recurring, to be fair. Lord of the Rings, there's the forging of the rings, but also there's Isildur, who is the guy who chops the ring off of Sauron's hand and then chooses, instead of destroying the ring, to keep it, perpetuating that long-scale conflict of good versus evil. And that event kicks off so many other things following that. The Chronicles of Narnia, right? The White Witch, all powerful. If you read The Magician's Nephew, which not enough people have, you see some really cool things in there too. But in, the main series, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which most people are familiar with, the White Witch casts Narnia into this endless winter, and that comes up and it kind of kicks everything else off. Now, the world needs saving. In Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn by Tad Williams, in my opinion, one of the all-time great epic fantasies, the Storm King is dying, but he's so fueled by hatred, his spirit lives on. And then that causes so many other things to happen. It's just, there's, in so many of these books, because the world is so alive, because there's history before the start of the novel, I thought it was really interesting to consider you could start building and outlining your epic fantasy world by thinking, what is the one event that changes the course of history? And I think that's a really cool way to approach telling an epic fantasy. Let me know what you think. Let me know in the comments below. What are some of the coolest epic fantasy worlds that you've read? Am I missing anything in my recommendations? We are going to have more recommendations at the end. I want to know what you think about that idea, though, of the single history-changing events. And if you have any other examples, let me know. There's another element of the epic fantasy that we really need to focus a bit more on. You heard me talk about most epic fantasies are series books. There's standalone ones out there, I get it, but most of them are big, giant series of books. Epic fantasy is usually a long-form storytelling experience. Multiple books, maybe even multiple timelines, complex themes. So the question is, of these kind of themes you can explore in these long-form storytelling adventures, what themes seem to resonate most with readers? One of the core staples of fantasy that I think exists here more than any other genre is the idea that readers like a slow burn. Unlike the fast-paced fantasy stories that you might find with Jim Butcher in the Dresden Files, which, hey, that's still fantasy. Or maybe a romantasy option like Sarah J. Maas, hey, that's still fantasy. Epic fantasy embraces the slow burn. It embraces a story taking hundreds of pages before the true inciting incident happens. It'll spend time foreshadowing and exploring prophecies and writing songs. And the character arcs that you'll follow for the series might extend over multiple books. For example, The Wheel of Time is a 14-book series, and the narrative spans multiple years, and you follow those characters for a long, long time through locations and trauma and stress and love. In these stories, you also have big universal themes that the authors will typically choose to explore. Things like destiny, power. Does power corrupt? Sacrifice, fate, free will, the burden of leadership, the cost of power. In The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, we get a whole unique sort of depiction of the reality of a hero versus the myth of a hero. And that's such an interesting theme to explore, and you don't see that kind of thing explored in many other genres. And as a benefit, I don't want to call it a side effect, but as sort of a bonus to the idea of these long spanning stories over multiple books, something you get in epic fantasy is character growth and transformation. Because we can spend time with these characters, we can see them go through so much change. Rand al'Thor in The Wheel of Time starts as a farm boy and then grows into this complex, troubled, misunderstood protagonist. This may be, when you really get down to it, the second most important thing beyond world building in epic fantasy. These characters that we can follow for years of the character's life, but also for years of our lives. How long does it take to get through The Wheel of Time? How long is it taking me to get through Malazan Book of the Fallen? You'll pick up a series in epic fantasy, like the Stormlight Archives, and it'll be part of your life for a decade. That's the joy of that epic fantasy. Yes, we love the epic battles. Yes, we love the cool magic systems. Yes, we love the big wars between kingdoms and betrayal and growth. But we also love following the characters. That's epic fantasy. And again, I always say this in so many of my videos, a story at its core is a human story, even the big epic fantasies. So if you're interested in exploring epic fantasy, either as a writer, which you can take all of these ideas to kind of help shape your story, or as a reader, of course, there are some required readings you might need to do. I know. If you're interested in epic fantasy, of course, the granddaddy of epic fantasy is Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, which, a little bit more of a standalone, still plays a role in the world. With The Hobbit, you get it. Now, when Tolkien wrote his books and they got popular, it would still take a long time for fantasy to sort of come into its own, this epic fantasy style of novel. There were books like The Belgariad by David Eddings. You had a little bit more lighthearted kind of books with the Dragonlance Chronicles, written by a whole bunch of different authors. In my opinion, the transition between traditional fantasy and modern fantasy starts with Tad Williams, with Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. Tad Williams, I will go ahead and tell you, may have some of the nicest prose in all of epic fantasy. Only seconded by Tolkien. Wait, hold on, let me rephrase this. In competition, there we go. In competition with Tolkien, with Guy Gavriel Kay, and Patrick Rothfuss. Tad Williams is a comforting read, and it's the series you should go to if you are looking for a slow burn world, a grand story, and an enjoyable reading experience to get lost in. Following the releases by Tad Williams, then you had A Song of Ice and Fire, George R.R. Martin. And this sort of showed that epic fantasy wasn't all just magic and quests and elves. But instead, you could have a grounded, gritty human story full of betrayal and politics in this same kind of setting. Of course, that's the Game of Thrones books. And then the big modern behemoth right now is going to be the Stormlight Archives by Brandon Sanderson. Another great place to start, very approachable. For those who have gone beyond the basics of reading epic fantasy, consider some of these books that are popular and well-known, but maybe you've missed on your radar. A series I've been getting through for the past 4 years is Malazan Book of the Fallen by Stephen Erickson, a very adult take on the epic fantasy. It is extremely dark. It is unlike any other book I've ever read. There's 10 books in the series. Each one tends to hover around 1,200 pages, and it is insane. The Ember Blade by Chris Wooding is sort of a modern retelling of the traditional fantasy story. The traditional, here's the quest. We need to get this magic item to overthrow the evil empire. The Ember Blade by Chris Wooding might have some of my favorite writing by an author, not because their prose is so pretty and, fairy tale like, but simply because the writing is just so approachable and it makes your brain feel good. You can pick up any John Gwynne series. Shadow of the Gods is the latest big one. These are epic fantasies that are built on more like Viking, Nordic style background as opposed to the traditional Tolkien European style background. Shout out also to The Will of the Many by James Islington. I wouldn't call it so much an epic fantasy, but the sequel's coming out in November, and that's something I'm very much looking forward to. And for a different kind of twist on epic fantasy, but what I consider to be still very much epic fantasy, the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. Something I talk about a lot, the first book of this trilogy, the 5th season, is a great showcase of an author who just nails POV so well. They represent first, second, and third point of view in their novel with 3 different characters, and it never feels out of place. It's a very impressive showcase of skill, and you can learn a lot from that. Epic fantasy is about immersion, scale, complexity, depth. It's about the world, but it's still about the characters. It's about good versus evil. It can make you feel good. It can make you feel terrible. If you are choosing to write an epic fantasy, you need to ask yourself, is your world rich and believable? If the answer is no, you have some work to do. Are your conflicts grand? Do they have high stakes? If they don't, you have some work to do. Do your characters change over time? Now, look, this is just core writing a novel, but hopefully the answer is yes. And if they don't, you have some work to do. Epic fantasy is ambitious, but when it's done well, it is unforgettable, because not only are you in love with the characters, are you rooting for them in a plot, but you are invested in the world. That doesn't happen with every kind of story. That's all I got for epic fantasy. This sort of idea of genre breakdowns, I'm still exploring the best way to present this information, and this was just my first go. If you have any feedback on maybe your thoughts about epic fantasy, any other genres you would like to see explored, any required reading that you think I missed, by all means, leave it in the comments below. If you're listening to this on YouTube, I would love if you could like this video. If you're following along on Spotify, rating this channel is the best way for this podcast to grow. And if you're following on Apple, I am not totally sure what you're supposed to do there, but any support helps. Come join us in the Discord. We have almost 500 other writers who are sharing resources and their stories, and I'd love to see you over there. That's where we have a lot of podcast discussion, and I'm really excited to see what comes from this one. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Happy writing. Come up with a great epic fantasy story. Let me know about it, and I'll see you next Wednesday.